Kodo Survey makes learning impact measurement easy and effortless. And our vision is to enable as many organizations as possible to measure learning impact. And we believe that if we can help organizations to do that, then we are contributing to a sustainable growth of those companies, but in the end also sustainable growth of society. So this is an important mission that we're on, we believe. We are helping organizations to measure serious metrics. Most of the organizations think that this is quite hard, and in particular it requires some work, so we're trying to automate as much of that as possible. And with the insights you get from measuring the impact of learning the way we do, our clients are improving the programs they're executing continuously. So we do surveys, as Chris put it. We are not doing interviews, diaries. We're not doing ethnographical investigations, observing, and so on. We are working mainly with large organizations with volumes of people being trained or attending learning and development programs in different ways. So by all means, if it's a learning intervention with 10 or so learners, then we are the first to say that it's probably better if we observe these learners at work. But when you're executing programs with hundreds of learners, or maybe thousands of learners within a period of a couple of months or a couple of years, periodically, then companies typically don't have the resources to shadow those learners, and then they prefer to do surveys because they can do so at scale. And this is what we help out with. And today I will share some of the ways that we are working. On the plan, I will introduce you to 6 levels of measurement. Probably I will forget the 6th level because it's level 0. I'll try to remind it, but following that, I will elaborate a bit on how to phrase objectives for those 6 levels. And in particular, I will look at the 3rd level application of the learning on the job, and also the 2nd, which is evaluating the learning as such. And we will talk a bit about how to phrase crisp objectives, which is something that's been around for a long time, but many people forget how to do it. Also, if you do that piece in a good way, you're going to save a lot of time when it comes to asking the right type of questions in the right way in your survey. So it's a fundamental piece for the 3rd point here, questions for your survey. So you will get some of all of these, some of all of these 3 things, the different levels to measure, how to phrase objectives, and also questions. But you will not become an expert in either of these areas. We're going to spend around 30 minutes on this, and then we're opening up for questions and answers during the last 15 minutes. So you will probably be inspired. You will scratch the surface a bit. Hopefully, you will get a lot of tips for what to Google or step into our website, where we have a lot of resources that you can download on all of the things that I'm going to mention here today. So that's how you will become an expert. That's when you start studying a bit and look into the material and potentially reach out to some of the experts in your proximity. So how do we measure learning? What should we measure when measuring learning? This model shows you the 6 levels. You see payoff, and it all starts from the left with an initial analysis. And you are probably the ones responsible for doing that analysis, asking the right questions to your stakeholders to clarify their expectations on what your L&D programs and training programs is supposed to achieve. And then we start from the top. Are there any payoff needs? Do we need to make money on this? Or is it okay that we don't? And sometimes it's okay that we don't make money out of this. We simply do it because we think that it is the right thing to do. Take a safety training, for example. Are we doing that to save money? Or would we do it even if we didn't save money on it? And indirectly, maybe we are saving money because it would get out to the customers that we don't care, for our co-workers, and the sales would decline and so on. So there's some goodwill and so to it. But do we need to measure whether there's a monetary ROI of this investment? So sometimes we don't care, sometimes we do. When we care, sometimes we're only looking for a break even, get our money back. Sometimes we're looking for a positive. So we want to earn money, but we don't really care if it's a lot or not. And sometimes we have a crystal clear ROI measure that we need to achieve at a minimum, say 250% of our investment. So that's the first step, the ROI objective. But how are we going to achieve that ROI objective? That's when we get to the next point, that's the impact objective. So which are the business needs? What is it that we are supposed to achieve in the business to get the return of our investment, if we now have such a target? Otherwise, we just start from this level. So here it could be some very tangible things like pure earnings, right? An increase in revenues, income, or a decrease of cost, maybe an increased sales directly as an effect of the learning intervention, or a decrease of cost could, for example, be some type of money awareness and cost consciousness awareness education in the company and so on. Very close to money. Sometimes we're a bit further away from the money. Could be, again, safety training, decreasing the number of accidents in a training, or reducing absence, or those kind of things. And other times we are very far away from the money. For example, leadership development, focusing on employee engagement and so on. To define the impact objectives could be easy if the company already have some well-defined KPIs that they're following up on a regular basis. In other situations or occasions, there are no such KPIs, and then we'll have to define them ourselves. We need to find the data sources to evaluate those KPIs, etc., etc. Third level, the application objectives, is here we are asking our clients, so if this is the ROI that you're expected to achieve, and this is the impact or the KPIs that you're expected to impact with this initiative, what are then the behaviors that will influence those KPIs? And that's the application objectives. The application objectives, this is, by the way, where you will probably need to involve an expert. And I'm not meaning an expert in setting questions to measure and so on. I mean an expert in the area, right? What behaviors will actually impact those KPIs? So if it's safety, then what are the safety measures that will actually drive the results? And you would need some type of safety expert to help you out with that. This is where you define those behaviors. And the right tool to use here is the SMART objective that I'm sure that everybody are acquainted with. So basically what you do is you define a SMART objective as an application objective. Let me give you an example there. So that could be, for example, within 90 days, and this is from a key account management training. I don't know if this is a good behavior or not, but I'm just giving you an example of a learning or an application objective defined as a SMART objective. Within 90 days from the actual training intervention, then the learner, in this case the key account manager, uses active listening for the first third of every customer meeting. So that could be a behavior, that we are looking to develop among the participants whom are key account managers. So that would be a crisp application objective, and we can measure that. And then we know also that we need to measure it 90 days after the training. Moving on to the learning needs and the learning, providing us the learning objectives. That's obviously, and I will not spend too much time here because I have another slide where I'm going to dig a bit deeper into it. But that's obviously about for you to understand and define what is then the knowledge that will help develop the behavior. So in order for a key account manager to start use active listening for the first 1/3 of every customer meeting, they probably need some knowledge. They need to know that this is expected from them to begin with. They need to know what active listening is. They need to understand how to apply the tools for active listening and etc., etc. So there's some learning that needs to take place here. And you heard that I said they need to know the tools and they need to understand how to use them. And that's what I will go a bit deeper into on the next slide. But before that, we have the reaction objectives. And before explaining what those are about, there's two different types of reaction objectives. We have the reaction objective and we have the planned action. And we know from our own research and also other research that reaction as such is not driving any learning or any application of the learning, and indeed not the application of the learning. So those type of questions are questions like, was the trainer any good? Did the trainer do a good session on the topic? Do you perceive the trainer as competent? Was the training material of good quality? Did you receive information about this training in due time? And so on. Those type of questions, measuring the perception of the learner, have no correlation with whether they are later going to apply any learning. On the other hand, planned action type of questions, they are tapping into the learner's intentions to use what they just learned. So we're measuring the intention, and we have a couple of different ways to do that. We can do it in a more perceptive way. We can ask the learner, for example, if they would use tool X in situation Y in order to achieve Z when they come back to work. That would be a way of measuring their intentions of the learning and the intention to actually use it when they get back. There we see some vague correlations with whether they are actually doing it. At the same time, there's a lot of factors inhibiting it or that could inhibit this, such as leadership. Is the leader asking the manager, is he asking or she the learner to apply it? Are they supporting them to apply it? Are they coaching them and providing feedback on these things that they've just learned, showing them that it's important and so on? I think we're all aware of that. And then we have the last level or level 0, which is basically other stuff. So I don't add that here as an alternative because personally I'm not very interested in it, but there are indeed 6 levels, and the other stuff is like volumes of learners over the period of the year. How many training occasions or programs did we execute? Did we stay within budget? And so on. So for me, that is not very interesting. On the opposite, if I have a lot of learners, but I realize that nobody's applying what they learned, then it's only a cost. If I have a lot of learners and I realize that everybody's learning everything and they're applying it when they get back on the job, then it has a lot of value. So it doesn't really make sense to measure that, according to me, and at least we are not doing it. So I told you I was going to dig a bit into the second level, the learning level of that V model, or does the learning get the knowledge and do they understand the knowledge? And here a simple and very old but still going strong tool is that of Bloom's learning taxonomies. And I'm only going to look at the first and the second one because it makes most sense. We are application. I've been through it. We work with smart objectives for that because then we also know when to measure it. But looking at taxonomy 1 and taxonomy 2, the difference here is that taxonomy level 1 is there for learning objectives or for measurements on learning objectives of knowledge. So quite a low level. I need to know. Here Bloom is providing us with a list of different verbs that we can use that makes it easier for us to actually measure. So what we are not supposed to use in learning objectives here is the actual word knowledge, or we are supposed to use verbs that can indicate in an observable way whether the learner actually possess knowledge. So words for that would be the first one in the list. It could be repeat and so on. If I'm able to repeat something that you have told me, then I have the knowledge of it. Or if I'm able to list it, then I have the knowledge of it. If we step to taxonomy level 2 instead, there we are supposed to, the learner is supposed to understand it, right? Comprehend it. And here Bloom is telling us to use another set of verbs, and these that I have here are only example. There's a whole battery of different verbs, but we have here, for example, explain. So if I know something, then I might not be able to explain it. But if I am able to explain it, then I understand it. So there is a difference here between learning objectives. So it's not as easy as just saying learning. It is also about whether the learner is supposed to know about it when they step out of the learning intervention, or if they are supposed to understand it when they step out of the learning intervention. And these two type of learning objectives need to be defined in very different ways, and we also measure it in very different ways. Let me see if I'm forgetting something here. And just to tell you here also, a typical corporate mistake that we see in the results that we get when doing measurements is that we are using a lot of understand learning objectives, so level 2. But then when it comes to the actual design of the intervention and when we measure it, we can see that they are only achieving level 1 taxonomies. So most of the learners, they know a lot when they get out from the learning intervention, but they are not understanding it truly, even though that was the learning objectives. And if you measure it the right way, you will be able to capture that and you will be able to do something about it. Typically, the reason that we see when we're doing a root cause analysis of that is that the companies, they're putting so much content into the learning interventions, the programs and the courses. They are duck feeding the participants with models, tools, and so on. And what happens then? Then they're spending a lot of time on a very shallow level, but they provide a lot of content. And that takes time away from actually diving into the different topics and truly understand it, rather than only knowing about it. So how does it look like when measuring the difference here? These here are two different examples. On one hand, we have taxonomy level 1. We want to measure if the learner is remembering what was conveyed in the learning intervention. And on the second example is on Bloom's taxonomy level 2, to measure whether the learner is actually understanding what they got out from the learning intervention. So the first example is what does SMART stand for? And then we have 4 or 5 different alternatives, and we're asking the learner to indicate which one is the correct one. We could also have an open-ended question here. What does SMART stand for? And then it's just an open box and the participant is writing something, but it's harder to quantify them. And what we are working on is training in scale, right? So you could also interview or you could observe, right, to find out. But remember that we are working with scale, so we are sending these questions to hundreds of people and maybe thousands of people. And then we are doing it in a quantifiable manner. So if the participant is able to answer the question, what does SMART stand for, and select the right alternative, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, then we know that they remember what the trainer was telling them. However, if we want to know whether they understand it, we need to pose the question slightly different. And one doesn't exclude the other. We can ask both questions, first to see if they remember it, and then to see if they understand it. And here we have an example. We're using the SMART objective again. Which of the following is the closest to a SMART objective? So this is not only about repeating something that the trainer said. In order for me to be able to answer this question, I actually need to understand what SMART stands for. So I need to understand that SMART is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And I also need to be able to look at an objective and evaluate whether it is defined in a SMART way. Obviously, the other 3 or 4 alternatives would be defined in an almost SMART way. And my job would be to make sure to identify that the one that is correct. So that is a simple way of distinguishing between level 1 taxonomy and level 2 taxonomy, whether learners know something or whether they have actually understood it as a consequence of the learning intervention. And if we measure this before as well as after, then we can see whether we had an effect of the training. Also, we can measure it 3 months later to see if the learner is actually retaining the learning. So fun fact, a while ago, we were sending out a survey to around 100 companies, and 85% of them told us that they want to measure learning. At the same time, 83% told us that they don't really know how. And around the same said that they don't really have the time to do it. And of course, if you don't know how to do it, then it's also hard to take time to learn that and then actually do it. So Kodo's working with a model, and we're using this model to try to automate all of this. When it comes to automating the measurement of impact, we have tried to automate it, but we haven't really succeeded. We still need the human touch to actually evaluate on impact, and it could be very scientific also, because as there's a lot of factors that could influence on an impact level. For example, the sales in a country. If we execute a large sales program in a country with the purpose to increase sales, and sales increases, then that might be thanks to the program, but it could also be thanks to some market conditions, competition, going bankrupt, or us acquiring some of the competition. There's a lot of other factors that comes into play here. So when we're stepping down the V model that I introduced in the beginning, we're getting closer and closer and closer to the actual intervention. And what we claim is that at least what we need to measure is on the behavior side. Are we changing the behaviors that we know will impact on the business? So, and typically that is based on what the expert says, which in turn is based on some clinical research and academic studies and those kind of things, or should be at least. So using with the KIBE model, we have the belief that the reason we do training is to change behavior. So we need to measure behavior, and we do that on the job. We cannot do that immediately after a training session or a learning journey and or learning program. We need to do it at least 3 months later on the job, because we know that if the training was not successful, then 80% of what I learned will be forgotten 3 months later. So that's a good timing of when we should actually start measuring the behavior. But waiting 3 months to get insights of whether our learning intervention is actually adding value or is likely to add value is to wait for too much time. So we need to measure something in direct connection with the actual delivery of the learning. And here we have seen, as I said before, that attitude and intention and knowledge together is driving the development of new behaviors. And also there's a lot of inhibitors in between, right? But from a learning perspective, knowledge, attitude, and intention drives behavior. So we need to measure knowledge, attitude, and intention. And we do so just before a learning intervention, and we should do so just after the learning intervention, because this is how we see whether the learning intervention is actually effectful. And now we can see if learners got the knowledge, we can see if they developed the attitudes and the intentions, and if not, then we can immediately start to continuously improve our training. 3 months later, we then get some indicators of whether it impacted the behaviors and whether the learning is actually applied on the job. Another fun fact, by the way, from the same survey going out to around 100 companies is that among those that are using data to continuously improve their learning portfolio is 555% more likely to measure behavior than those that are not using data to continuously improve their learning portfolio. Also, they are 113% less likely to measure attendance and number of learners in the programs and number of programs and so on. So level 0 stuff. So what I'm trying to say in this slide is that we need to measure before, just after, and we need to measure on the job. And there's a couple of different things that we need to measure. We measure knowledge, attitude, and intention in close connection with the actual learning intervention. Behavior, we measure it just before and we measure it after, because otherwise you don't have a benchmark to compare with in order to see if you actually had an impact of your learning intervention. And those things should be measured 3 months later. We could also measure it 6 months later and 9 months later and so on to see if the behavior is actually sticking in the organization. Let me give you an example of how this could look like and what the type of insights is that you could get out if you're starting to measure learning in this way. No matter you do it with the Kodo platform, you could also do this with Google's Google Forms or Microsoft Forms and so on, SurveyMonkey, etc. Then by all means you would have to build the algorithms and do the calculations yourself. But nonetheless, this was a client that wanted to look at a communication training program that they have for some of their most senior specialists. This is an international knowledge company, you could say. What they could see among the participants of that program, and this is taking, I think, 2 occasions or something like that. This is data from 2 or 3 of their programs. It's a program where they go quite in depth on the taxonomies, and so there's fewer participants so that they can really get it under their skin. What they could see from the analysis is that the participants, they actually possessed quite a lot of the learning that they were supposed to get out of that. So already here, we can tell the client that the ROI potential of this program will not be very high, most likely, because both on the behavior side and on the learning side, the participants. They are already possessing a lot of the knowledge that they're supposed to get, and they're already behaving at least according to 30% of the expectations that they are supposed to live up to after the training. So that will influence the ROI potential. We could also see, that's the second bar on the left side on the post-test, we could see that they did indeed get some knowledge out of this. And then the third bar on the left graph tells us that the learning retention is quite high. It's probably around 80% or something like that, saying that they are keeping 80% of what they learned. So it seems like it's relevant for their job. On the behavior side, however, they didn't have the impact that they were looking for. They went from having participants living up to 30% of the expectations, behavioral expectations, to living up to 55 or so of those behavioral expectations after the training. And they immediately started to use this data to redesign the learning journey. So I will tell you a bit about what they did, just to inspire you for what you can use this type of data for. But in the bottom left, you can see that we are, and this is an old dashboard of ours because it is a couple of years ago, but we are classifying this as an entertainment, not an education. So on the left end, you have the immediate effect, right? How much did they actually learn? And then on the x-axis, you have this classical satisfaction survey. Most organizations, they are doing a satisfaction survey. And in this case, they scored more or less highest on all those questions. They scored an average of maybe 4.7 or 4.8, so very high scores on that end. But on the learning, it was inadequate. It's not good enough to pull out 8 highly paid senior experts and put them in a room for 8 hours to train something that they already knew. So what they did was they decreased the amount of time together. They by removing a lot of the basic things that they spent time on. So they spent less time together, and instead, in order to push the behavioral effect up, they integrated coaching with a similar amount of time that they spent in the classroom before, divided on those 8 participants. So they completely redesigned the program with a maintained budget, but the impact increased. They could see the pre-knowledge go down because they were spending time on the right things now, and they could see the behavioral impact go up. Another example, and this is my last example, and then we're going to move into Q&As and spend some time there. Here we have this is a leadership development program. It is not one of those leadership development programs for beginners or new managers. This is for all managers in the organization at the same time. It's an organizational company with around 3,000 co-workers, and they were starting out doing a pilot in Sweden and Denmark in order then to move on to Belgium and the American market to train the managers there. What they could see, and I think this is 1 or 2 occasions, what they could see was that the managers possessed a lot of these tools and the knowledge that they were supposed to acquire out of this learning program. And the learning program was a program with 2 or 3 sessions, meeting up, sitting down for a couple of days, going home, applying it, coming back, and so on. So they possessed a lot of it already. They got some out of it. They kept most of it. And then if you take a look on the behavior side, you can see that they actually dipped in behavior 3 months later. So they were living up to the expectations less 3 months later than they did before. Now, this difference is not significant, so we don't actually have to pay attention to the fact that it is less. But what we see is that there is no impact of this training. So what the client did was they actually closed down the program. It was, after all, a pilot. So they closed it down and they refocused to investing on mentors and the coaches for their leaders instead, to step in and do individually tailored development of the managers in the organization. So that's how you can actually use insights from a learning impact measurements to make sure that you don't spend dead money on learning and development. And with that, I open up for questions.
Thank you very much for that, Fenix. So a couple of questions we've had come through, and this is something we hear all the time within the training industry. How many questions should there be in a typical survey? Is there an amount that's too many, or is there an amount that's too less? What would your advice be for the number of questions that should be in a survey?
Yeah. So in the end, I'd say that it depends on the number of learning objectives and the type of learning objectives that you have. So you have defined what it is that you want to achieve. Now look at those objectives and decide which of these do we want to measure, and in order to get an indication of if there's value here. But it's still a good question, because the more things you measure, the less the response rate is likely to be. Maybe people will start the survey, right, and then they will get tired of all the questions and they stop in the middle and those kind of things. So you need to find the balance. Typically, if you have in the normal length of a training program, I'd say that 20 questions is okay. If you have more shorter e-learnings and so on, I would actually only go for an MPS question. That's it. Because typically people are committing less when doing e-learning. So that also has impact on the response rate. My motivation to actually spend time on answering a survey is higher if I've been in a room with a trainer than it is if I've been in front of a computer doing a SCORM package e-learning. So there's a lot of things to take into account, but say between 10 and 20 for the normal situation.
Between 10 and 20, that's interesting with regards to feedback on e-learning. Less questions, shorter questions for e-learning, whereas instructor-led questions, you're much more likely to give in-depth feedback. You talked around response rates. So obviously the length of the survey can impact response rates, and it's something we hear quite a lot of, training providers wanting to increase response rates on surveys so they can get that data and use that to improve their course offering. Have you got any other tips, tricks or advice on how to increase response rates aside from the number of questions on the survey?
Yeah, it's a concern of everybody, all of our clients actually, how to tackle the survey fatigue and get the response rates up. Yes, there are several. We actually worked with a company several years ago who were executing, and they were implementing SAP, and it was super important for them to be able to see during the weeks before the go live date that their co-workers actually possessed the knowledge of how to do the right transactions in the right way in SAP, right? Because otherwise, when they turn the key, everything would stand still, right? In the CRM system and even doing the inventory and everything. So what they did was that they really pushed the communication and the awareness among the co-workers that we are using this. It is super important that you tell us about it. They said this when all the participants came to the training, and if anybody had not done it, they made sure that the link for going to the actual survey was open 1 hour into the training, and they took time in the beginning of the training to actually answer it. So they didn't start the training until the 1 or 2 people that had answered it actually did. They did the same at the end of the training, saying that, remember, it is super important for us. It's not that we are evaluating you. Chris was also into that, right? The fear of being evaluated myself. We are actually evaluating ourselves, and the intention of this is to improve our delivery and in order to do a good job and so on, right? And then they could see that the response rates radically went up. In particular, obviously, for the pre-test, also for the post-test, but also for the job test. So going from a response rate of maybe 20% in the job test, which is the hardest to get a high response rate for, because it's a bit later, right? Things have settled, to actually getting 50 or 60% response rate. So hard work, communication, and removing this fear of being evaluated.
So Well, thank you very much for your insights there, Phoenix. Some really good insights into feedback, how to collect it, and then what to do and action it from there as well. So thank you very much for giving up your time today to come along to Everest and to share your thoughts with our delegates and our participants. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely evening.
Likewise, Chris, and everybody else.
Excellent.
Bye.
So that brings us to the